So welcome everybody to this webinar, Leadership's Perception Gap, Research on Diversity, Inclusion and Managers. My name is John Hackston. I'm a chartered psychologist. I'm head of thought leadership at the Myers-Briggs Company. So for the next hour, we'll be looking at diversity, but especially at inclusion. And at the evidence that perhaps leaders, perhaps managers, aren't quite as inclusive as they would like to think they are. Now, as we go through, do type in your questions. We should have some time at the end to answer those. And we've added some links in the attachment section as well, including these slides, a copy of these slides, and some resources to help you find out more. And I should also add that this webinar is going to be recorded and will be available on our website to watch again or to share later. So today then we're focusing on inclusion and inclusive leadership in particular. But before I get into the details of this, I'm going to ask you a question. And it's not a question that you need to tell me the answer to, or by all means put some comments on what you think about your answer to this in the questions box. Here it is. How committed is your organization to diversity, to equity, and to inclusion? What actions, perhaps, has it taken to improve these? As I said, this isn't a formal poll or anything, but I think it's very much a question worth asking. And speaking of polls, we will be launching a number of polls as we go through to see how included you feel you are in your organization. So do keep a lookout for these, and yes, please do answer those as we go through. But however you answered that question or thought you might answer that question, whatever happens in your organization, there's certainly a lot of attention given to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one result we've seen is an increase in diversity-related jobs. Here you can see some statistics from an American survey ran a couple of years ago. So 90% of Fortune 500 companies have onboarded an executive whose focus is on diversity. And in the last 5 years, there's been over 100% increase in executives with job titles relating to diversity and to inclusion. And global data from LinkedIn suggests very much the same thing. And of course, there are good reasons for this. There's still really very much a hill to climb when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I can see from your answers in the questions section that some of you are saying your organizations are very committed, but it may be that not all organizations are in the same way. So, for example, the gender pay gap still exists. Women are paid less than men on average in every European country where data has been collected. Now, on the latest data, the UK has one of the smaller gaps here, but a gap still very much exists. And women and people from a minority background aren't as represented as they should be in top-level jobs. The data you can see on your screen now is based on 38,000 mainly American executives and 135,000 senior managers who took the MBTI assessment, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, between 2012 and 2021. Back in 2012, the proportion of women at executive level, that's the orange line you can see on the graph there, was only 35% of where it should be. By last year, 10 years later, it had risen to 40%. So things are getting better, but really very slowly. Now, these are the sorts of troubling findings that motivate organizations to create diversity programs. But sadly, these don't always work. There was an article in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago by Frank Dobbin and Alexander Kalev that looked at the effectiveness of different forms of diversity initiatives. What they found was that most of the time, mandatory diversity training had turned into a box-ticking exercise and didn't actually increase diversity at all. In fact, for some groups, it actually made things worse. The proportion of Black women in management in those organizations had actually decreased by 9%. On average, our number of Asian men shrank by 4% and Asian women by 5%. Many participants in that training saw it as unnecessary. They resisted attending the training, and maybe because of that, some people reported more animosity to other groups, people different from themselves, than they did before the training actually happened. Sometimes it may be that diversity programs take too simplistic an approach or ignore the bigger picture. So, for example, attempting to recruit individuals from minority background without paying attention to how included or excluded these people feel once they become an employee. Do these people then feel appreciated and encouraged to participate fully in the organization? Do they feel part of an organization? Or do they just up sticks and leave after a short while? And for some of these programs, in some organizations, the missing ingredient might just be inclusion. Because without inclusion, diversity programs are quite likely to fail. Here's one example. Last year, you may have seen in the news some items about the underrepresentation of minority groups in science in the United Kingdom. So, for example, 12% of white scientists in UK universities have reached the level of professor, but only 3.5% of black scientists. Black scientists are less likely to get an academic job in the first place, whatever their degree, and when they do get a job, they're less likely to be promoted and are more likely to leave. And though this data has only recently been formally compiled and analysed, it sadly wasn't a surprise. There was an article in the journal Science 5 years ago entitled "Without Inclusion, Diversity Programs May Not Be Enough," warning about this very issue in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and maths. And to quote the article, simply admitting an underrepresented minority student is not enough if that student feels unwelcome, unheard, and undervalued. And sadly, in many organizations, you can probably replace the word student in that quote with employee. So without inclusion, diversity programs may not be enough. So what is inclusion exactly, and how does it work? It's often thought of as something that somehow needs to be done to people, done to groups that have been historically excluded from society, from organizations, from management. But of course, actually anyone can feel included or excluded at work. We carried out some research last year into inclusion at work, and these are some of the things that people said when we asked them what inclusion was. I'm respected for who I am. I can be my authentic self. I feel included by my co-workers and by my manager. I feel able to participate and to contribute. I'm included in decision making, and my views are respected, accepted, and acted on. And I think one of the things that comes through from this, and indeed from our research more generally, is that inclusion is about relationships between people. To some extent, at least, diversity can be mandated from the top down, but inclusion is much more about the voluntary actions of individuals. And I've been talking here about our research, and one of the things we do at the Myers-Briggs Company is to carry out research into work-related issues, and much of what we're talking about today is based on one of those pieces of research. And you can actually see a link to one of our current surveys, which is actually about conflict at work, on the attachments tab of this talk. So if you have a moment, now or later, ideally later, please do complete that survey. But the answers you can see on the screen now came from a survey that we carried out last year, where 251 participants answered lots of questions about how included they felt at work. And if you'd like to try one of those questions for yourself, some of you already answered the poll that we've got running at the moment. Please do have a go at that poll. I'll be looking at your answers in just a short while. But let's quickly look at who took part in the research before we look at the results. This was an anonymous, entirely confidential survey, and people from all sorts of different organizations took part. Most consider themselves to be either female or male, although other groups were represented, and the majority consider themselves to be heterosexual or straight in orientation. Several different races or ethnicities were represented. Here's the breakdown for the UK sample. Other categories applied for different groups, and indeed half the sample worked in the United States, over a quarter in the United Kingdom, and 15% from elsewhere in the world. So that's who took part in the survey, but let's see what sort of questions we asked them. Because we didn't just ask people one question, we asked them a whole load of questions about how included they felt at work. And here's one example. Now, earlier we asked you to invite you to complete this question yourself as part of a poll. So let's just see how you answered it. So it looks as if 34% of you strongly agree with that statement. 34% of you strongly agree that your manager seeks out other people's perspectives, including yours. Another 48% agree, 6% neither, 10% disagree, and 2% strongly disagree. So overall, if I just work out my numbers quite quickly here, it looks as if I've got my numbers right, but 82% of you agree or strongly agree with that statement. So thank you for completing our poll. And there'll be another different poll along in a moment, so do keep a lookout for that. Now, let's see how the people in our survey actually answered that question. So what we're going to show you now are the 3 most agreed with questions and the 3 least agreed with questions in the survey. So, for example, for that question you can see on your screen at the moment, I'm accepted by my co-workers. Only 2% strongly disagreed with that, 4% disagreed, 12% neither agreed nor disagreed, 48% agreed, and 34% strongly agreed. And if those numbers are a little bit small for you to see on the screen, 82% agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Here's the rest of the top 3 statements and also the bottom 3. So the question we asked you, my manager seeks out other people's perspectives, including mine. 82% of you agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, 75% of people in our survey. So it looks as if you as a group may feel a little bit more included by your manager on average than the people in our survey. Now, if you read through those numbers on the right-hand side there, you can see that generally speaking, those numbers are positive. Generally speaking, people who took part in our survey felt more included than not. The only one single question in the whole survey that less than half agreed or strongly agreed to was that last question. My manager shares their awareness of their personal blind spots and biases, but overall results were pretty positive. Now, all of these questions were about how included people felt, what we've called perceived organizational inclusion. We're an organization of psychologists. We like to give things exact names, so perceived organizational inclusion. We'd actually written those questions based on previous research to measure 4 different dimensions, 4 scales, if you like, of inclusion. First of all, how included people feel they are by their co-workers. Secondly, how included by their manager they believe themselves to be. Thirdly, the extent to which they feel valued by their organization and the extent to which they feel at home in an organization. And last but not least, the extent to which they feel able to be their real, authentic selves at work. And this slide should give you an idea of the sorts of questions we actually asked for each dimension. Now, when we looked at the scores on these scales, we did find that some people, some groups, felt more included than others. So, for example, people who preferred not to disclose their sexuality felt less included, felt less valued and at home in the organisation, less included by their co-workers, less included by their manager, less allowed to be their authentic selves than any of those other groups. What I should say here is that this survey was entirely anonymous, entirely confidential. This was made really clear to participants in the survey. They came from a range of organizations. There's no way we could trace them back or tell their organization, even if we wanted to, which would be unethical anyway, anything about how individuals answer the questionnaire. But yet still, in this entirely anonymous survey, some people felt they couldn't disclose their sexuality. And those people, in terms of working in their organizations, felt significantly less included. So those who preferred not to disclose their sexuality felt less included. You may also notice here that they are much less included than any other groups, but looking at that data overall, people who were heterosexual or straight, or who said they're heterosexual or straight, actually were the highest or the second highest on each of those scales. But interestingly, one question in the survey showed a very clear difference between these different groups of people. That question, I rarely feel excluded by my co-workers. 2/3, 68% of those who express themselves as heterosexual or straight agreed or strongly agreed with that statement, but only half of those who said they were bisexual, only a quarter of those who said they were gay or lesbian, and 11% of those who said they prefer not to disclose. So that last group felt particularly less included, but with other groups there are some things about feeling less included as well. Members of minority groups felt significantly less included in those 4 specific areas: the extent to which they felt accepted by their co-workers, the extent to which they felt they could be honest with most of their co-workers, the extent to which they felt they were treated fairly at work, and the extent to which they felt at home in their organisation. But of course, this majority minority is a very broad grouping and really puts together some very different groups of people. So we did have a big enough sample to look at some more specific groups, especially actually in the US sample, which, as you recall, was the largest group. 56% of our total sample was from the United States. And the headline finding there, I guess, was that people who said they were Hispanic or Latino or Latina, they very much came out worst. They felt the least valued by and at home in organizations, and the least able to be their authentic selves. White British and white UK groups felt the most included of all the different groups, with American, Asian, and African American or Black in the middle. Other groups were too small to statistically analyze rigorously, because these stats you see here, these differences were all statistically significant findings. They are real findings. And we did indeed find that some individual questions showed especially large differences. And if you look at the Latina column in particular, you can see, for example, that at the third question down, at home in my organisation, 72%, nearly 3/4 of white UK people agreed or strongly with that. 66%, 2/3 of white US, 75% US Asians, only 37% of African Americans, and only 20% of Latino individuals felt at home in the organisation, and only 20% felt they were encouraged to be their authentic selves at work. These weren't the only differences we found in the data. For example, job level had an impact. More senior people felt more included. In particular, people at the C-suite, executive and senior management levels scored significantly higher on the scale of feeling valued by and at home in an organisation but middle management, first line management, or regular employees. So very clean break there between the highest level people and middle management. We did find that diversity programs did have a positive impact. Where there was a diversity program in place, people felt more included by their manager. So the green bar here represents people in organizations where there was a diversity program, the red bar people in organizations where there wasn't. But we also found that programs that specifically concentrated on inclusion had a much bigger impact. And all of these programs were seen as more effective if they contained a training element. Anything that was mainly and purely target-driven was seen as less effective, or even as box checking, even more so for inclusion than for diversity. Now, there's a lot of data on this slide, so I'll just talk you through it. The bottom line here is that where the attention paid to either diversity or inclusion had decreased in organizations, people felt less included on all four scales. So what we found was that if individuals thought that more attention was being paid to diversity or inclusion than last year, then they felt on average a bit more included than previously on all four scales. That's the green bars on the charts. But if things had just stayed the same, that's the orange bars. But if they thought less attention was being paid than last year, that's the red bars, they felt much less included. What this means is as if you have a big push on inclusion one year, you need to keep things going. Or actually, people's impressions how included they feel might even be worse than if you hadn't started down that road in the first place. Now, an individual's personality did influence one particular area of research, area of inclusion, I beg your pardon. And in this research, we've used the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI framework. But before I start going through those results, for talking about the MBTI in a bit more detail, let's just see how familiar you are with the MBTI, so I know how much detail I need to go into it. So let's look and see how we'd answered that last poll. So looking at people who answered that poll, we can see that 31% are MBTI practitioners and use it often, so you will know hopefully quite a bit about the MBTI. 28% are qualified but haven't used it recently. 31% have received MBTI feedback but actually haven't been trained to use it, and 2% have heard of the MBTI, and 5% of you are saying, what is the MBTI? So what I'm going to do now is just spend a little while, just give you a little bit of background of the MBTI. So those of you who are qualified or have recently received feedback, let me just crave your indulgence for a short while, just while, for benefit of other people on the webinar, I just say a little about the MBTI. So on its basis, the MBTI looks at 4 areas of personality, and you can see those on your screen at the moment. First of all, it looks at extroversion and introversion. And this is all about where you get your energy from, where you focus your attention. Do you focus your attention on and get your energy from the outside world of people and things, in which case we'd say you have preference for extroversion, or do you focus your attention on your inner world of thoughts and feelings, in which case we'd say you have preferences for introversion? And a key thing to mention here is that we all do both. We all do some things in the outer world, we all do some things in here, but for those of you with an extroversion preference, we do more stuff out there. That's really where we focus our attention and get most of our energy from. For those of you who have a preference for introversion, we spend more time in here, given the chance, and that's where we tend to focus our attention and energy from. Sensing and intuition is about information. Do you prefer and do you trust information which is solid, which is real, which is actual, which is practical, which is based on the hard evidence of your 5 senses, hence the word sensing, or your really clear memories of things you've experienced in the past? Or do you prefer to look at and trust information which is about how things connect together, what the possibilities are, what could be, where things are heading in the future, rather than what past experience tells you. In which case, we'd say you had preferences for intuition. Again, we all do both, but we have a preference one side or the other. Thinking and feeling is about the process you prefer to use to make decisions. Do you prefer to make decisions on objective logic, in which case we'd say you had a preference for thinking, or do you prefer to make decisions on the basis of how they gel with your values and how those decisions might affect people, in which case we'd say you had a preference for feeling. And last but not least, judging and perceiving how you deal with the world around you. Do you prefer to live your lives in a very organized, structured, planned way? In which case we'd say you had a preference for judging. Or do you prefer to live your lives in a more open-ended, unstructured, unplanned, spontaneous way? In which case we'd say you had a preference for perceiving. So those are the four areas of the MBTI. We have preferences for extroversion, introversion, sensing, intuition, thinking or feeling, judging or perceiving. So those preferences then combine together dynamically to say something about the whole you. So, for example, if you had preferences for introversion rather than extroversion, sensing rather than intuition, thinking rather than feeling, and judging rather than perceiving, we say you had preferences for ISTJ, the responsible realist. I know that's sort of a box you can see on the screen there. It's not a box which should confine you. It's more like you live in a house with many rooms. This is your favorite room. This is where you like to spend your time, but you can flex your time and do things differently if a need arises. So how does this relate to inclusion? Well, personality did relate very much to one particular area of inclusion, how included by your manager you feel yourself to be. And perhaps it's not surprising that that one particular interpersonal relationship is particularly affected by the personalities of individuals who took part in the survey. So as you can see from the slide there, people who have preference for introverted sensing felt the least included by their manager. People who had a preference for introverted thinking felt the most included by their manager. So let's just talk through what we've looked at so far. We've seen that inclusion has several different dimensions. And we've seen also that most people feel included, but that some people don't. And particularly people who feel they can't disclose their sexuality, to some extent, lesbian and gay stuff, minority groups, especially in the United States, those of Latino, Latina, or Hispanic backgrounds, their senior employees, individuals where, in organizations where there are no diversity and especially no inclusion programs, and where less attention is being paid to diversity and inclusion. But why should we be concerned about inclusion? Why should we worry about it? I suppose it's nice that employees feel included, but does it really matter if they don't? Well, the evidence suggests that it does matter. An increasing amount of research suggests that inclusion is important. So, for example, employees who feel more included perform better, are more innovative, and they create higher performing teams. Workplace inclusion increased innovation, job satisfaction, quality of care in that one particular group, hospital service staff, and that's second piece of research. And in two pieces of research showing that inclusion increases organizational citizenship behavior. Organizational citizenship, for those people who haven't heard the term before, is about being a good citizen in your company, in your organization. These are behaviors which probably aren't explicitly part of your job, not part of your job description. They may not be explicitly rewarded by your organization. In fact, they probably not. but are the glue that holds the organization together. They really help the organization to function. Maybe things which are about individuals, things like being kind to your fellow employees, being courteous, showing altruism, or maybe things which are more helpful to the organization as a whole, being conscientious, doing the right thing, doing your duty. And research does suggest that feeling included increases those organizational citizenship behaviors, which ultimately is good for the organization, which ultimately is good for the bottom line. And indeed, another piece of research showed that valuing inclusion led to more inclusive HR practices, and that in turn increased the effectiveness of the organization. And we've carried out another piece of our research ourselves into this. And what happened in that research is our participants completed the scale of feeling included by your manager, which we've looked at, and also a measure of well-being in the workplace. What we're going to look at is the average level of well-being of people who scored at different levels on the manager inclusion scale. So, for example, if you look at the chart on your slide now, the left-hand side bar in the palest green colour represents people who had a low score on the manager inclusion scale, a score of 1 or 2. People who didn't feel included by their manager at all. And if you read over to the scale at the left-hand side, you can see that these people had a low level of well-being. The higher the level of inclusion by manager, the more you will feel included by your manager, the higher your level of well-being on average. And for those of you who like statistics, this is a nice big chunky correlation of nearly 0.5. There's a very strong relationship between inclusion by your manager and workplace well-being. And that isn't just so nice to have. We know from other research that people with a higher level of well-being, they're less likely to be looking for a new job. And in this time when many people are leaving their work and looking for new jobs, that's clearly really important. They're likely to have greater engagement with their work, higher levels of job satisfaction, they feel more emotionally committed to the organization, and they show more of those positive organizational citizenship behaviors we talked about before. We also included another questionnaire in this research. It's a questionnaire about counterproductive behaviors. And these are sort of the opposite of organizational citizenship. These are things which actually are counterproductive to the good functioning of the organization. Things like, for example, bad-mouthing your organization to people outside your organization. And here we found there was a negative correlation of minus 0.29, nearly minus 0.3. The more included by your manager you feel yourself to be, the less likely you are to indulge in those counterproductive behaviors. So there are some really important findings there showing that the more included people feel they are, that really can affect how well the organization might function. So if inclusion is important, if feeling included is important, how do we increase inclusion? To find out, we asked our survey participants the question you can see on your screen at the moment. What action would make you feel more included? And before I do the big reveal of our results, you might want to think about how you would answer this question. Maybe put a few comments in the question box. What action would make you feel more included in the workplace? Now, this was an open-ended question, so our survey participants could say anything they wanted to here. But their answers did fall into a number of overall themes. So let's have a look at those now. So you can see there that the most common theme, the top theme, was more contact and communication with and transparency for managers, and that included senior management. That's the most common theme. So it's something about relationship with the manager that was particularly important. Then action on specific issues, then being included or consulted as an employee. And then the fourth option is actually some people said, it's okay, I already feel included, nothing more is needed. As you read down through the list, these become some of the less common responses to this question. You can see that second from the bottom, some people have said inclusion has gone too far, we should stop talking about it, take care of the majority. And men were much more likely to say things like that than women in our survey. The bottom option, everybody who said something along that bottom line theme was either from a minority background or female or both. And these are people who are basically saying, stop treating me as a token, stop pointing at me as an individual and saying, look, it's making me feel less included when you're treating me as a token. To use the language of one of them, stop treating me as your trick pony and wheeling me out whenever you want to appear to be an inclusive organisation. Okay? And I can see that there's a couple of, there's one answer in the questions there. People have asked for my opinions and ideas, more collaborative and less dictation, which I think fits with some of the things that we said there. Okay. So these are actions that might make people feel included, and that relationship with a manager was perhaps one of the most important. So this all suggests that this idea of inclusive leadership is important. People's relationship with a manager may be a key component in how included they feel they are. But if that is important, it's clearly important that the managers do behave in an inclusive way. So a big question is just how inclusive are managers? Well, what we could do is we could ask that question. And actually, we have a poll open at the moment where we're asking you one of the questions we gave to managers in our survey. So if you're a manager yourself, please do answer that. We asked any participants in our research who are managers or leaders to answer 11 questions about their inclusive leadership style. And the question you can see on the poll at the moment there is, I regularly seek out the perspective of others, including those I lead. And we use the same scale as we're using in the poll view at the moment, a scale from strongly agree through to strongly disagree. So let's see how you've answered that question yourselves. And I'm aware that not all of you are managers or leaders, so not all of you will have answered this poll. So I'll end this poll now. And let's look at your answers. So 68% of you have strongly agreed with that statement, and 31% have agreed with that statement. So basically 99%, oh, the numbers have just changed a little bit. It's gone up to 100%. Almost all of you, or all of you, believe that as a manager, you regularly seek out the perspective of others, including those I lead. Okay. Let's see what people in our survey said. So these are the results from our survey. And you can see that overall, managers rated themselves as very inclusive. At the top of the chart there, 99% said, I show respect for differences and adapt as required. 99%, I can see how my background and experiences are different from others. And you can see the numbers going down the phrase there. Okay. If we look at the question that you answered as a manager, I regularly seek out the perspective of others, including those I lead. That's about halfway down. You can see that 95% of our survey managers or leaders agreed or strongly with that. So you're a little bit more in agreement with that. You feel you're even more likely as a group to regularly seek out perspective of others, including those you lead. But as you can see, those numbers stay in the 90s or 80s, almost to the end. The only ones that dips below almost 80% is our last question. I openly share my awareness of my perspective, my personal blind spots and biases, and even then, 2/3 of our group actually answer that. So it looks as if managers are inclusive, or at least the managers who took part in our survey are very inclusive. It may be that we happen to have some very inclusive leaders take part in the survey. Or maybe, just maybe, something else was happening. And we were able to check this because 8 of those 11 leadership questions match the questions that we'd asked all survey respondents about their manager. So, for example, we asked people, how much do you agree with my manager seeks out other people's perspectives, including mine? The question we asked you. And we asked leaders, how much do you agree with I regularly seek out perspectives of others, including those I lead? This, as we've already seen, is how leaders saw themselves, very positively. And this is how they rated their own manager on the corresponding question. So that first question, 99% of you agreed or strongly agreed with our statement, 95% of our survey, but managers and leaders in our survey, only 77% of those agreed or strongly agreed that their own manager did that. Indeed, if you look down that list, on every single question, leaders rated themselves as more inclusive than their manager. On average, across all the questions, they rated themselves 23% higher than they rated their manager. And if we look at people in the survey who are not themselves leaders, they were even less positive about their managers. The average difference between these ratings and the leader's self-rating is 33%. Now, of course, it is possible that some managers in our survey deliberately set out to make themselves look good, to cheat, if you will, to make themselves deliberately look better than they knew they really were. And that's the sort of thing that might happen if you're using a questionnaire in recruiting people for a job, for example. But this was an entirely anonymous, entirely confidential survey. There's no reason for people to try and skew the results. No one was going to see the results individually. So it might be more likely that some, maybe many, maybe nearly all leaders have an unrealistically positive view of their own inclusive leadership behaviors and attitudes. They generally think they are inclusive when perhaps they aren't, or at least not as inclusive as they feel themselves to be. There is a leadership perception gap. And that perhaps is a little worrying. Because if leaders already feel they are inclusive, what is the impetus, what is the motivation for them to try and behave in an even more inclusive way? Now, one of the ways you try to combat this is by developing a virtual workshop to build inclusive leadership. And what we try to do here is to teach leaders the behaviors and the skills needed to drive a culture of inclusion and to enhance performance. And the program really concentrates on what we've called diversity of thought, how people differ in their perceptions, their experiences, their backgrounds, their work styles, their values, and of course, their personality types. It's a 3-part workshop that starts with participants finding out more about themselves using the MBTI framework, and that includes a self-evaluation of their inclusive leadership style. But unlike the participants in our research, feeds out back to them, challenges their assumptions, and builds on it to help them enhance their degree of inclusive leadership. And in fact, the inclusive leadership questions we use in our research are a subset of what we use in the program, which looks at a number of different aspects or facets of inclusive leadership, so it's best to help people to plan how they may enhance their inclusive leadership behaviors. So today we've spent some time looking at research. Really, we've just looked at some of the highlights of that research today, but in the attachments, you'll see a link where you can download the whole research report, which goes into these in a lot more detail. But let's talk about what we may have perhaps learned from today. We can see that the results show that there are 4 facets to how included at work people feel themselves to be, and that most people feel themselves mostly positive about all four of these aspects. But some people don't feel so included. And there are a number of, I think, practical actions that organizations could take to increase the levels of perceived inclusion in their workforce. They can start perhaps by making it clear that they are at least maintaining the amount of attention being paid to diversity and inclusion. As we've seen, increasing the amount of attention will bring some benefits, but that really needs to be sustainable year on year. Ensure that there's an inclusion initiative or program in place. The results, as we've seen, suggest that only having a diversity initiative, while that's useful, isn't as effective as having a dedicated inclusion program. And also really useful to make sure that those programs include a training element, or they may just be seen as box ticking and actually even, in some cases, end up being counterproductive. Now, as we've seen, some people feel less included. Organizations may want to review what they're doing to make employees feel valued and really think about whether their culture allows individuals to speak out. And this shouldn't just apply to new hires, but to all existing employees as well. And that includes middle and junior managers, because as we've seen, they perhaps feel less valued by their organization, less at home in the organization than some of the more senior individuals. And as we've seen, it seems that some people may feel they can't share their sexual orientation, even as an anonymous survey, and that these individuals then feel significantly less included. So some organizations may find it useful to check if the culture of their business allows people to be gay or bisexual or lesbian or trans without consequence to them. And this article that I reference here by Marek, Yuneas, and Brune Eichardt talks through a range of strategies that your organization might find useful. And you'll be able to download a copy of these slides from the attachments so you can refer to that at your leisure. Now, we've seen that personality affected how included by their managers people felt themselves to be, and also actually how inclusive managers and leaders believe themselves to be. Because managers, leaders who scored higher on inclusive leadership, were more likely to have an intuition personality preference. And we've seen that individuals with introverted thinking and also introverted intuition or extroverted intuition at the core of their personality felt more included than others. And I think that both of those results really emphasize the importance of the personality dynamics of the manager-employee relationship in really fostering feelings of inclusion. Now, in practical terms, I think this means that managers should be really aware of the importance of personality and individual differences in the way they work with, in their contact with their direct reports, and very much avoid a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to fostering inclusion. I think managers should perhaps be aware of their own personality preferences and of how they can perhaps best work with others, their reports, and others with different personality preferences. And although inclusive leadership is in general likely to foster greater levels of inclusion amongst the workforce, our data does suggest that some leaders may overestimate how inclusive they are. And we've seen that asking leaders to just self-report their levels of inclusive leadership shouldn't really stand on its own, but perhaps form part of an integrated program including other elements, like the development of greater self-awareness, facilitated self-assessment of their own inclusive leadership, and indeed other feedback as well, which is, of course, why we put together the Inclusive Leadership Program. So we're moving towards the end of our sessions now. So if you have any questions, you haven't yet put in the questions box, please do answer those, and we'll go on to those in a second. We'll answer those in a moment. But let me just give you a few minutes about why I go through some of the products and the other offerings we've created support organizations with challenges like inclusive leadership. We've talked a little bit about the Myers-Briggs type indicator and how personality is relevant to inclusion and to inclusive leadership in particular. If you'd like to be qualified yourself to use the Myers-Briggs type indicator assessment, the next available date you can attend one of our training programs is on the 1st to the 3rd of August, and that's a virtual program at the moment, but we will be moving towards face-to-face ones soon as well. And if you do want to train sooner, there may be other options available, so do leave a message, do speak to a member of our team, and we can talk about it. One of the things that we found from talking to our qualified practitioners is that a lot of what they're doing has become more coaching based as teams need more advice really in a moment to cope with the things that are going on. We do have some coaching courses, and you can see the dates on there, and there's more dates and details on the website of those. If you do need a tack of those, if your team's like, no, you're not already qualified to the MBTI, you don't have the expertise or perhaps the people in your organization to facilitate those sorts of programs, there are some ready-made sessions that are led in person by a consultancy team. That first session, each of those typically helps the people in the group to think about their individual personality types and what that means to them and others, and then follow-on sessions help them to build resilience, to look at how they manage change, and look about how they enhance communication. And one of our new offerings in that area as a virtual program is obviously the Inclusive Leadership Workshop, which we talked about before. But there are other programs beyond that Inclusive Leadership offering as well, and you can see the details of all of those on the website. So I think we do have now time to answer your question. And let's have a look at some of your answers. First, nice easy question to answer first of all. Apologies, John, I missed the first few minutes. How big was the audience surveyed? It was actually 251 people. So that's a nice easy answer. A second question, I'm interested to know, has a sense of staff inclusion been affected by working from home in these last 2 years? Really good question. I'd love to give you a definitive answer to that, but I'm not going to. And the reason I'm not going to is that one of the previous surveys we've now closed just a short while ago, and we're currently crunching the numbers for looks at remote, hybrid, and in-office working, and the contrast between those. And we did ask a couple of questions about inclusion as part of that survey. So I'm currently still crunching the numbers for those, but we'll have a report out soon. We'll be able to share that information as soon as we have it in terms of the differences between those two groups. And we did ask people a little bit about their reactions to COVID in that survey as well, and be able to see if there's anything into relationships there. So thank you for that question, and apologies apologies that I wasn't able to answer it sooner. Any research on how these results map onto thyroid profiles seems relevant at first glance. Let me just take a step back for those of you who aren't familiar with thyroid B. The thyroid B looks at interpersonal relationships, and one of the scales of thyroid B is called inclusion. And it's not quite the same as inclusion as we talk about here, but it has links to inclusion. And to answer the question, we did ask people who took part in the survey if they knew their thyroid results. We did actually send out the survey to some people who previously filled in the thyroid, and there were some links. I'm desperately trying to remember off the top of my head exactly what those links are. I remember they did reflect the pattern that you might expect. They did relate to the thyroid inclusion scale. I can't remember sadly exactly what they are, but if you'd like to download a research report, I know their results are in there. Here's a really good high-level question. I'm curious as to whether your work can be extended into society and not restricted to business, and also whether it is your intention to do so. And I would love to do so. I don't know if we have the facilities to do so. What I would say is that if anyone is interested in using the questions from our inclusion survey, if anyone's setting up their own survey in an organization or on a wider basis, I'd be any researchers out there, very happy indeed to work with you to give you access to those questions. And maybe we can do something collaborative. Really good question. No plans to do it wider, but it would be really interesting to do so. So thank you for that. Does inclusivity replace employee engagement? My answer would be no, because I think it is something distinct. I think they are linked. I think, although we didn't explicitly look at use a standard employee engagement questionnaire in our survey, some of the questions in the survey do relate to engagement. I know there's other evidence out there from research that people who feel more included also feel more engaged with organisations, and in particular the scale of valued by peers and helping organisation that we had in our research links to engagement. But it's not quite the same thing. I think they are both interesting different lenses to look at the way that people interact with and are on board with their organisations. So thank you very much for that question. Okay. Let me have a look at some of the other questions. There's a question, what wellbeing assessment was used? This is actually a research questionnaire that we have ourselves. We just use it for research so far. We provisionally call it the Global Wellbeing at Work Inventory, a nice formal sounding title. And what it really looks at is a number of different aspects of wellbeing very much in the workplace. We've called it the pre-man model of looking at well-being because it looks at a range of different things like relationships, like the extent to which you experience positive emotions at work, the extent you hear negative emotions at work. You can see again some more information on our well-being research on our website as well. So thank you for that question. Okay, on the slide where you talked about sexuality, you didn't mention trans people. So we did offer people a range of different categories when it came to both gender and also sexuality. You didn't see all of those on the survey simply because the numbers were effectively too small to do robust statistical analysis. Because all the findings that you saw actually in the survey were based on statistically significant differences. We didn't put trans in there because there were just too few people in there. I think another shortcoming on the survey is that we weren't able to ask any questions on people with disabilities. Again, that's something that for other research may help people to feel more or less included by the organisation. We didn't feel able to do that simply because we knew we wouldn't have a sufficient sample size. But if anyone out there is working with disability rights organisations, again, we're very interested to work with you to see if we could use some of those questions and see to what extent they applied to those groups in the workplace. So I think we're nearly at the end of our time together. Some of you may have noticed there's one further poll open at the moment about would you like any more information about topics we've covered today. If you would like any more information, please do answer that survey. In the meantime, if there's any further questions, do get in touch. But we're going to close this at the moment. We said we'd take an hour, and we're just coming up to our time. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope it's been an interesting hour, and hopefully you've been able to get some useful information from it. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.